Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride. And you join us for a special show where we're going to be discussing refugees and asylum. It's World Refugee Day tomorrow, so in honour of that we are going to be discussing those issues. So joining me to do that in the studio is Professor Alison Phipps, UNESCO Chair for Refugee Integration through Language and the Arts. Alison, how are you this evening?
It's lovely to be back here in the studio at last.
It is, yes. Yeah. It's a strange world seeing people in the flesh, but there we go.
It is indeed, yeah.
And we're joined online by Pinar Aksu, a human rights activist based in Glasgow. Pinar, how are you?
Good, thank you. Yeah, Friday evening.
Excellent. And by Hyab Yohannes, who is a UNESCO scholarship holder and PhD student at the University of Glasgow, and is also an Eritrean refugee himself in the UK. So, Hyab, how are you this evening?
Thank you. Good. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, we start, as we always do, with just a quick roundup of the news before we get into our special topic for the evening. So as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 222,516 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 204,412 were confirmed negative, 18,104 were positive, which is an increase of 27 new cases today. This will be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all of those with symptoms will be tested. Of the people who have tested positive, 528 were in hospital last night. 9 of those were in intensive care and another 10 were in intensive care with suspected COVID-19. And the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection has sadly risen by 6 today, with the total now standing at 2,470. This number only includes those who have died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures available show that 42,461 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have now sadly died from their illness, an increase of 173. This number does refer to deaths in all settings now, not just those in hospitals. The Scottish Government today began to move towards level 2 of lifting lockdown measures. From today, shielding households may meet with one other household for outdoor activities, provided that physical distancing is strictly observed. Single-person households, including single-parent households with children under 18, may form an extended household with one other household, enabling them to stay in each other's homes and bypass physical distancing guidelines. As of Monday, the construction sector may begin work again, and parts of the NHS will begin opening up to deal with a backlog of routine screening and urgent referrals. Full details are available on the Scottish Government website, www.gov.scot. The Joint Biosecurity Centre has announced its recommendation that the COVID-19 alert level should move from level 4 to level 3, meaning that the virus is in general circulation, but infection rates are not rising rapidly. In a statement today, the Centre reported that the CMOs for England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have reviewed the evidence and agree with this recommendation. We have made progress against the virus thanks to the efforts of the public, and we need the public to continue to follow the guidelines carefully to ensure this progress continues. New powers and measures to align devolved Scots law with those in the European Union after the end of the Brexit transition period have been published. The bill focuses on 3 headline areas. Part 1 provides for a discretionary power which will enable Scottish ministers to align devolved Scots law with EU legislation following the end of the transition period. In Part 2, provisions are made regarding domestic replacement arrangements for EU environmental principles and governance. This will ensure that there continues to be guiding principles on the environment in Scotland following the end of the transition period. And a new governance body, Environmental Standards Scotland, will be established to replace the system of environmental governance provided by the institutions of the European Union, which will be lost at the end of the transition period. The SNP Shadow Chancellor, Alison Phipps MP, has said Boris Johnson must perform an urgent U-turn and extend the Brexit transition period. As a new report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies warned, a bad deal risks hampering the recovery from coronavirus. Johnson and others in government have repeatedly stressed that there will be no extension of any kind. The European Union is committed to an agreement with Britain on its future relationship with the EU, but not at any cost, European Council President Charles Michel said today after a meeting of EU leaders. He told a news conference that Brussels and London needed to intensify negotiations before the transition period ends on December 31st. He added that the EU's positions on level playing field fairness issues and Northern Ireland remained essential. And finally, human rights campaigner Malala Yousafzai has earned her degree in PPE from Lady Margaret Hall at Oxford. Malala, who was shot in the head and neck by Taliban fighters after campaigning for girls' education in her native Pakistan, became the youngest ever winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, which she won aged 17 in 2014. She said she was full of joy and gratitude at graduating. She has previously said that once her education was over, she wanted to return to Pakistan to become a politician and prime minister. But for the time being, she said all that comes next is Netflix, reading and sleep. So we do offer our congratulations to Malala, along with many, many other students just now who are just coming to the end of their courses. I'm sure, Alison, you know a lot of people who are just coming to the end of a very stressful period.
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, just to congratulate everybody who is graduating at the moment, and also just to think about this as a year that's been quite extraordinary for students and for staff at universities across Scotland, you know, pivoting all their courses to online, thinking about how to do the assessments online, and then doing their examinations, working out how to do that in a way which is fair and cogent, and then coming to the point now where we're beginning to see people receiving their degree results. I mean, I know at the university, we were so looking forward at the University of Glasgow to graduation. It's always such an extraordinary, ancient event, and such a ritual event, a rite of passage. And you can tell it's a rite of passage by the shoes and the funny costumes. And we were just really looking forward to people having that day with their families and friends and their tutors. And, you know, we will still do that. Yeah. And we are now thinking of how we do that online. But it's just very hard not to be able to be together. Yeah. But I do think, you know, all credit to my colleagues at the university who've come up with really creative ways of thinking about marking the end of the year for the students and celebrating what they've done and what they've achieved, because it is an achievement this year like no other. Yeah. And it will always be the case that it's been like no other for everyone concerned.
Well, certainly we hope it will always be like no other. We don't want this to happen again anytime soon. But as I said, we are here to discuss refugees and asylum. It's a big issue and has been a very big issue in the news for all sorts of reasons for several years now. So we want to talk all about that. If you want to join the conversation, you can do so at home by joining us on Twitter. You can follow us at Broadcast Scot, and as you can see on the screen there, if you use the hashtag Scotland@7, you can join the conversation. We will flash some of those tweets up on the screen during the show. So that's Scotland@7, Scotland AT and the number 7. Well, we would love to hear what you've all got to say. But we start, really, I want to just get a very basic picture of where we are with asylum. Alison, is there any sort of definite number of refugees in Scotland, in the UK, in the world? Do we have any idea of these sorts of numbers?
It's very, very hard to give any accurate figure. And it's interesting, I'm always asked for figures. People always want to be able to weigh and measure it. And come up with exact numbers. And there are good reasons for wanting to have numbers so that people can actually do the actuarial work of planning a society and government and through policies. But a lot of the time, you know, figures are bandied around with very little understanding. So we will hear phrases in the media all the time, such as, there is an unprecedented number of refugees. This is not true. There is not an unprecedented number of refugees. And Jeff Crisp, who is former head of policy at UNHCR and now deputy director of Campus at Oxford University, would be one of the first to say, in actual fact, the numbers of people seeking refuge worldwide has remained roughly static throughout the period since the convention. That this, in that sense, is not an unprecedented period. What is unprecedented is the fear of the nations in the global north to which slightly larger numbers have been coming and who have been asked to to step up and do some of the work of resettlement. So that's what's actually happening. And again, across the UK, numbers have remained relatively static. I mean, I've been tracking this, I think, for probably the last 15 years, and they've been between 22,000 and 35,000 people arriving each year and claiming asylum. Not everyone will gain asylum, but that's the ballpark. It's not a large number of people. In recent years, of course, with the hostile environment of the UK government, the UK Conservative government, we have seen a drop in the number of people arriving and claiming asylum, but we have seen a commitment by the UK government in 2015 to take 20,000 refugees from Syria under the resettlement programme. That was 20,000 over 5 years. And what I do know is we aren't even close to meeting that quota. We've taken about 2,000, I think, at my last count. That might have changed in the last little while. But about 2,000 into Scotland since that was done under a really successful resettlement scheme that has been run by COSLA, by the local authorities. And I think what was really heartening at the time was that all 32 authorities in Scotland agreed to resettle people under the Syrian resettlement programme. And so we went from a situation where the majority of asylum seekers and refugees were in the UK, were in the Glasgow area and some in Edinburgh, to a situation where this was dispersed across all of the 32 local authorities. I have to confess to having been very sceptical at the time of that policy. I wasn't sure that actually it was a good idea 4 or 5 years ago for us to step away from the expertise in the Central Belt, and particularly in the city of Glasgow, and to let others begin that work on their own, often with very little experience of that beforehand. I would be the first now to really eat my words and say that actually the learning that has come from this, the understanding that has come out of community development, is really significant across Scotland, and it has meant that we've been able to build a much wider capacity than just the capacity within Glasgow. But there's still a long, long way to go, and it has been with very small numbers compared to other countries worldwide. So obviously Germany took over 1 million, and is continuing to do so. Countries like Sweden and countries like Hungary, even Austria, took large numbers of refugees under that resettlement programme. But those numbers are also as nothing compared to where the majority of refugees and asylum seekers are hosted worldwide. And that is in countries like Turkey, like Lebanon, like Jordan, like Uganda, Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, Pakistan. So these are the countries in the Global South that do the majority of work in supporting and sustaining refugees. And my colleagues at University College London have done a very large study looking at the way that actually, and this is where it will be really wonderful to hear from Pinar and Hyab about this, the people who do the work of hosting refugees are refugees. Are people who are former refugees, refugee background, people who are asylum seekers waiting their claim, the people who really carry that weight, that burden, and do that work and have the knowledge and the expertise in our societies are those people who have that experience. Which is why, of course, in Glasgow, the organisations supporting refugees are led largely by former refugees. So thinking of Merry Hill Integration Network and the work that Pinar is doing with Rima Sharifi, thinking of the Scottish Refugee Council led by Sabia Zazai, and their peer education networks run by other refugees, thinking of the work we do within the UNESCO chair with experts by experience who are refugee background, leading that work because they are the people who have the knowledge, the expertise, and also the resilience to have made those journeys and survived, who can really help us, who are trying to show solidarity with them in civil society, to understand how that work needs to be done.
And Pinar, obviously you've had your character reference there from Alison. If I could come to you here. As Alison says, people who have experience of being refugees are very often people who are working with refugees, and you fall very much into that category. Could you just tell us a little bit about what a refugee faces when they arrive, say in Glasgow? What are their options? What kind of income do they have to live on? Just some of those kind of basics on what the life of a refugee is once they reach us here.
Yeah, I think there's like two parts to this. There is the people who are seeking asylum, and then there are the people who have the refugee status. So I'd like to first maybe just cover briefly about experiences of asylum seekers, because they have different rights to refugees. So when we have people coming here and seeking asylum, for example, they are living on as little as £35 a week, which is provided by the Home Office. People seeking asylum also cannot work, so many people come here with skills such as former teachers or lawyers or doctors or chefs or artists. However, they are banned from working. So many people we have at my workplace where they've been in the asylum system for over 5 years, in some cases 10 years, and they cannot use their skill at the moment, which is a huge barrier for people. Another aspect of this is it's been in the news last week. I'm sure we will talk about impact of COVID-19 on people. However, when people get their asylum support, like I said, it's not enough for people to live on that. And sadly, last week we've seen that there has been an increase of 26p to asylum support per day. I'm just looking at buying a bar of chocolate of Freddo that costs 25p. So this is the amount of increase that asylum seekers have been given on a daily basis, which is quite sad to see happening at the moment. So these are some of the difficulties and rights that people have when they're seeking asylum. And as Alison have mentioned, there are different rights and possibilities and journeys for refugees. For example, those who arrived with the Syrian resettlement program, at my workplace, what we done is we assessed people's needs from the day that they arrive to the community. So the needs that we ask people are what they need within the community, what barriers they might have been facing, or what barriers they are facing. One of them could be the language barrier. So I think language, obviously learning English and integrating into the community and knowing about the community is very important. And as Alison have mentioned, we had to follow the approach of using community development methods, where we look at and assess people's needs and have that as the basis and centre for having people's experiences, and so that they can know the country and also the city that they'll be living in. I could talk about the projects that we do and everything, but maybe I'll just pass it back to you and then. Yeah.
No, that's excellent. Thank you. And I wonder as well, if I could maybe come to you now, Hyab. There are, as we've said, there are lots of places in the world that are under much more pressure from refugees than we are here in Britain. Could you tell us a bit about what some of those areas are, and why some of these large numbers of refugees exist? What are some of the pressures that are causing people to leave the countries that that are home?
Yeah. As Alison and Pinar just mentioned, the refugees, over 85% of the refugees are in the global south. I guess from the studies show. And what I would say is the main challenge that refugees are one of why refugees are becoming refugees is because of the situation is in their home countries. If we take the example of Syria, for example, there is a civil war going on for years now. If you take my country, Eritrea, there is always the problem in addressing its independence, because whether it's after the border war or other issues with the government, and there are many issues happening in parts of Africa, Northern Africa as well, with the changes in the government that are coming, and with the lot of civil unrest as well. And these are the main reasons why refugees are fleeing.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, obviously, there are places where we could have an impact on the world stage, and for some of these places we are an active participant in Syria, obviously, prime among them. What do you think Western governments like the UK, like the EU, like the US can do more to help some of these countries that are doing the majority of the work in dealing with refugees?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that the Western countries, the rich countries, basically can do. One of them could be sharing the responsibilities. It could be sharing resources. It could, because there is a lack of adequate resources in those countries. I lived in Egypt for 3 years, and one of the main challenges that I used to see there was the shortage of resources. There are no medical services for refugees, educational services. There are no accesses to services for many refugees, and helping those refugees to get those kind of services would mean helping to alleviating the impoverishment, alleviating the homelessness that we see there, alleviating the bureaucratization of their lives in those hosting countries as well.
Mm. And Alison, if I could come back to you now, this question of what part we have to play, or what part our governments have to play in this. There's obviously been talk for years about pull factors, the kind of the ever so generous British social security system that's that they're coming to milk. This is this almost
for £35 a week.
Yeah, exactly. This
really,
kind of really absurd argument. But clearly there are factors behind people. That's why people are being driven out of their own homes.
Yeah.
What's your feeling about the role of the West in causing some of those crises? Because it's not just wars like in Syria. There are other factors. There are famines. There's even climate change is now becoming a serious issue. How much can we do to address some of those other underlying issues?
I mean, I'm often asked about root causes and and what we can do, and my answer is often campaign against the arms trade. Why do people leave? As Hyab just said, because of conflict in their own countries, because of insecurity, because of lack of resources, because of greed at gunpoint. And that is also getting worse with climate-induced migration, and the majority of international development organisations have climate justice as one of the key pillars of their work. I'm thinking here of SCIAF or Christian Aid or Oxfam. All of them know how scarcity of resourcing for you to be able to feed your family is becoming a crucial issue across much of the world. And we're even just seeing it in Scotland at the moment, where we're having to water to actually make sure that we will have ripe fruit. And often in Scotland we don't have to water. We're actually experiencing these things at home. So all the work that we do around peace education and the diplomacy around peace, around disarmament, around nuclear disarmament is absolutely critical to this. But equally the work, we have had a reputation for around the last 20 years, if not longer, as being one of the countries in the world with the deepest philosophical understanding of what international development is actually about, which is about participation, about co-design, not about helicoptering people in to do humanitarian aid. Sometimes we need to do that. Sometimes we need to put doctors, medics, food on planes to emergency places. But international development is different, and international development has been about working with local communities in similar ways to the ways in which I think the best work of refugee integration is done in this country, through people like Pinar and Hyab, who are the experts who know their communities, know the needs of their communities, do the needs assessment, know that what the resources are, and then work with the agencies who might have raised some resource to say, right, this is how I think we need to deploy this for the long term, the medium term, or immediate aid. Now, we've just abolished DFID. It's being called a merger. It's not a merger. It's a hostile takeover. This is a way of actually looking at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office taking the 0.7% GDP that we committed to after Jubilee 2000, after we all marched in Edinburgh in 2000 to make poverty history, after the Gleneagles Summit where we got that commitment. all of that we are just seeing being diverted into the coffers of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and into intergovernmental work. So I think we're now on the back foot again, having made that remarkable progress. And what we now need to do is try and protect the 0.7% for work on international development, for work within the refugee contexts. It is often good practice to keep people as close as possible to their families and their friends. But as Hyab and Pinar will tell you, this isn't possible. The idea that there are pull factors dragging people to the great nirvana that is the UK at this moment in time, with over 60,000 deaths and rising, and a government that has not been able to manage us as a country in a way that has kept us safe, is a fallacy. People move with connection and safety, and that safety changes on a day-to-day basis when you're on the road. Where you are safe, where your family is safe, will depend on who you can understand who is speaking to you, who you recognise who might speak your mother language, where it is you might find somewhere to be for a while. And that will be through extended networks of family, of friends, of people known by people. And then it will be the agencies, perhaps the logoed tents of UNHCR and other UN organisations and other refugee organisations, but they're not the first port of call. The first port of call is who you find who's of your own. And that would be the same for you and I, Kenny. If you just try and imagine what it might be like if you had to pack your bags and go and you don't know where you have to go, what would you be looking for when you landed somewhere? You'd be looking for something familiar, something you understood, something that said, I'm going to be safe enough here for the next day and the next day. So this idea of push and pull factors, it's it was taught to me in O-level geography in the 1980s. It's a really outdated notion. And in the context of migration research at the moment, we're tending to think more about corridors, so areas where you see certain demographics finding a degree of safety, so passages that we see. And I know Hyab has worked for these organisations himself in the past, a Safe Passage in particular, which have been looking to try and produce, if you like, corridors where people are granted safe passage. Now, we know that people might be able to find a degree of safety on some of the journeys, but get to the Mediterranean, there's no safety in that passage. And many human rights organisations are actually at the moment campaigning for safe passage. And safe passage at the moment literally means upholding the maritime law of the sea that says we will not let people drown if we see them in distress. And at the moment, we know we are letting people drown if we see them in distress. And at the moment, that means no refoulement. That means no sending people back to where they came from. But what we know is happening with some of the coast guards from Italy and Greece is that people are being turned back, and that has been EU policy. And again, to cite my colleague Jeff Crisp, he time and again has said, you really must make sure that when people are being returned by boat to Libya, that you look at what the conditions are in Libya and that they are safe for people to claim asylum, and they are not. Categorically not. But these are things that Hyab, I know, and Pinar can speak about with much more experience and eloquence than I can.
Well, this idea, Hyab, of safe corridors, I mean, this is obviously going to garner a political reaction. It's the kind of thing that people who don't want any more refugees are going to be horrified by, the idea that we're going to make it easier for refugees to make it to the UK. What has been the reaction that you've found when you've been working on this kind of idea?
I think the first thing is we need to understand that refugees travel because their human security is at risk, and their continued biological existence is at stake as well. These are the main reasons why refugees are traveling, and the safe corridors could be like family reunion, sponsorship programs. These are like regular ways of coming to safe countries. It's like moving people from detention centers in Libya or refugee camps, people stuck in refugee countries for generations, and taking those people and giving them a chance to prove themselves, a chance to live a dignified life is what the safe passage or the safe routes can provide for them. And these are really good, and many people are hopeful of these kind of activities when they see them and when they get the opportunity.
Now, I would like to focus a wee bit on the situation in the UK and in Scotland, because I think there are two different conversations going on. The UK, as we've seen over the last however many years, has leaned quite far to the right, has been very heavily influenced by UKIP, by kind of British nationalism, by this fear of the other, of foreigners coming in and taking our jobs and all these kind of things. Whereas in Scotland, the rhetoric has generally been very different. The government and most of the opposition parties have generally been very supportive of human rights issues. Pinar, I wonder, how big of a difference do you think that conversation has really been, and how big of a difference do you think it makes to refugees and asylum seekers on the ground?
I think, as you've mentioned, there are clear differences when welcoming asylum seekers and refugees in Scotland. However, we must also acknowledge the difficulties that people still face when they're seeking asylum in Scotland. We still have the detention centre in Scotland, the one and only detention centre, which is a Dungavel detention centre, and it's not far away from Glasgow. It's only an hour away, and there are still people who are being detained at this moment in detention centres. So I think we still have a huge role to play to make and create a safer and a humane immigration system in this country. One of the other aspects at the moment that we are seeing is the asylum seekers at the beginning of the pandemic have been removed from their houses into hotels. And this happened in Glasgow, in Scotland. And around about more than 400 asylum seekers have been moved into hotels by the private contractor, which is the Mears, who's housing asylum seekers in Glasgow, by Home Office. So I think at the moment people are in hotels. There is no guarantee that when they were being transferred into hotels from their houses, there was full PPE protection when this was happening. There's a high risk that they might be at the danger of catching COVID-19 just because they are put into hotels where being in physical contact is so much easier than if you were left in the house. And I'm not sure if people watching this have heard, but last month a Syrian refugee called Adnan was found dead, sadly, in a hotel in Glasgow as a result of being moved from his house to the hotel. Obviously, it's been investigated at the moment, the reasons why this happened, but there is a clear evidence that the immigration system and the hostile environment had a role to play, contributing towards this young person's death while seeking refuge in this country. So I think there is a huge steps to be taken in Scotland, and as you've mentioned as well, huge steps to be taken by our politicians in this country, so that when if there is ever possibility of becoming an independent country, that we create a safe and a humane and just immigration system based around and on human rights, rather than trying to have numbers or labeling people as coming over here, taking our jobs or taking our benefits, which is the racist remarks we've been hearing over the years again and again. So I think we have once again, a huge role to play to make Scotland a welcoming country. And just to mention on about what happened on Wednesday, there's a clear evidence that we've got lots to do to challenge racism in this country, and to say that actually asylum seekers and refugees are welcome. And I think every individual in this country has a role to play in this, whether you're a member of the community or you're a politician or you're just an ordinary person who's just angry about the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. And we all have an individual responsibility to make our community safer and welcoming.
Mm. And Hyab, kind of a similar question to you. What's been your experience of the media in the UK and the way that refugees are talked about, the kind of not just the media, but obviously politicians as well. But the way that some of these issues are framed, how does that feel for you as a refugee when you see the way you're talked about?
Yeah, that's right. That's a very good question. Yeah, for me personally, it feels like it is a kind of exclusionary tactics that the governments and some of the politicians and some of the media outlets say. Like refugees, as you just explained, have been portrayed as if they are like a threat to the hosting society, as if they are takers of the resources here. And these are not really true. These are like, most of these issues are not true, and these are heartbreaking for me, even as someone, as a refugee who's living in the UK, to listen to those kind of things.
Mm. And Alison,
Yeah.
kind of a similar kind of point. What does this the media landscape say to you?
Yeah, I mean, the media landscape's a really tricky area. We have elements of the media, and I would say, the National, the Ferret, we have the Guardian, who largely are trying to really nuance, understand, but also say this is an issue of human dignity. We are signatures to the 1951 Refugee Convention. Therefore, we should uphold it. And this isn't a matter of opinion, this is a matter of law. And I think, particularly I know the work that Hyab's done previously with around legal frameworks and legal education is absolutely vital for us upholding the rule of law and holding on to the rule of law. And again, I regularly come on to this programme and say the same. In a democratic country, it's the rule of law that is important. But what we also know is that the Home Office has repeatedly come up against the rule of law, breached the rule of law, been taken to court by the immigration lawyers who are often the heroes of the peace in our country at the moment, and who are challenging the many decisions and the poor quality decision making by the UK Home Office, and are winning on appeal. And I think that then just points to the fact that the Home Office at the moment appears to be a wing of government which is in need of, I'd say substantive reform, but actually I think that's too mild. Right now, I would say we really need to look at dismantling it and building a just Home Office. We're seeing this with regard to questions of policing, and we're seeing this with regard to questions of immigration. And we've seen this since the establishment of the hostile environment, and then the way in which that has repeatedly violated the rights of Black and ethnic minority people, refugees, and asylum seekers. So, since the Go Home vans were on the street, we have seen a landscape in which, coming out of Westminster, there has been a discourse of intolerance that has been produced, and the dog whistle politics that we've all seen. That said, it is really important we say two things at this point about the landscape in Scotland, and there is plenty more that can be done. And I know that last week Anna Sawa, Hamza Youssef made very clear statements to the Scottish Parliament on this, and have really, along with a number of leading activists of the Black and ethnic minority communities across Scotland, Pinar would be one of these, but also Graham Campbell, that people have had to step up and speak in public about their experiences of repeated racism. And that is often individual, but also systemic and structural. And it's not good enough. And it is held in place by the way in which our laws are not upheld, by the way in which we whitewash and window dress. And we may be shocked, we may be horrified as members of society when we may be, as I'm hearing from members of my own family at the moment, be told, I don't recognise this country. But the fact that we don't recognise this country shows the extent to which we have lived in silos, and we do not have a majority understanding of what the experiences are of people like Hyab and people like Pinar day in, day out. But we do know that discourse makes a difference. And what we have seen in Scotland from the First Minister through the leading politicians is a discourse which has said, refugees are welcome here. You are welcome. Scotland is your home. You are our own. And we have seen that language. Now, at the moment, that's language, and there's a lot more to be done to make sure that that is true. And I think, we might want to just look at this extraordinary poll that's just been done by the Scottish Refugee Council, where they have polled people, or Survation have polled people. They polled last year in June 2019. They've polled again in 2020, and have found that 73% of Scots think that people seeking asylum should be allowed the right to work, Currently, people are not allowed the right to work and want to work, want the dignity of being allowed to support their own families. And that 52% of people think people seeking asylum should receive financial support the same as anyone else on universal credit. Not at these paltry rates of £37 a week.
I mean, it's not like universal credit is a lavish income at the best of
It
times.
too is a broken system, and anyone who's tried to claim this, and we've seen this from Paul Sweeney, the former MP, who has been tweeting about this week and about his experiences of it and what he's now got to live on, and all credit to him for doing that publicly. That is another element of government that is reserved to Westminster, that is in need of severe reform. So I think all of this points to a real need for more devolved power to Scotland, if not an independent country. And I know that here on this programme we would very much want to support an independent country. But I do think in that polling again from the Scottish Refugee Council, we see that the majority of people believe that Scotland should have the right of decision making over asylum and immigration decisions. If we can do that, we can also then properly enact what is in the New Scots integration policy. And now I chair the New Scots integration policy for Scotland, for the Scottish Government, COSLA and the Scottish Refugee Council partnership. And it says that asylum seekers and refugees have the right to full integration in Scottish society from day one. And that is upholding their rights of asylum under the Convention. It's enshrined in human rights. But it's very hard to do that when those rights are undermined by the legislation in Westminster. So there's a lot more work we need to do, and we need to do that on many fronts within our own country.
Now, a whole lot of issues came up in those last couple of things we mentioned there. I did want to come back to you, Pinar, on this issue of how refugees are facing the COVID crisis. Because obviously you have a lot of people already on very, very limited incomes, people, as we've talked about, who aren't allowed to work at the best of times, now clearly not able to work. Almost nobody's allowed to work just now. There's also been this issue of people being put in hotels and not given access to decent food and whatnot. Could you just talk a wee bit about what those issues are and basically what needs to change in your view?
Absolutely. I mean, when COVID-19 started, when the pandemic started, the first thing we did was to ask the people what their needs were. And we did this process by contacting our members and seeing what difficulties they are facing and also what they might be facing. And there is a similarity with some of the aspects being the same issue for everyone. I mean, one of them is when people are seeking asylum or refuge, they come to use community centres or public areas like libraries and centres to access Wi-Fi and to use the internet because obviously they can't have broadband in the house. So that means that they would have to use pay-as-you-go. And now when people are stuck home, just to watch a movie, your data would be finished. So a lot of people are actually putting into the dark end of being isolated, where they cannot have any communication with their friends or with their family members, and they have to rely on organisations or friends or the community to see them outside or to have access to internet. I think this is one of the important aspects, and we are seeing that COVID-19 is going to go through to some of the months. So there has to be a immediate response to digital access for the people who are at home. One of the other important aspects is, as you mentioned, not being able to work. Obviously, a lot of the people and our members are indicating that if they had the right to work, they would want to be up at the front as one of the key workers, as one of the essential workers to help in the community and provide and share their skills. And as Alison mentioned, it's a huge, powerful research to see that over 70% of the public in Scotland want and would support for asylum seekers to have the right to work. And there is actually a campaign running at the moment called Lift the Ban, and it's a national campaign So whether you're in your workplaces or community, you can sign the petition and also raise awareness about not being able to work for asylum seekers. The other aspect, as you mentioned, is just talking briefly about people being moved into hotels. It's a very inhumane action because people were already in their houses. They already had a safe environment. There wasn't a high risk of contacting the virus. However, now not being able to get proper food, not having that space of the distance, the physical distance on hotels, is putting people at huge risk. And actually, what we've seen with the death of Adnan from the Syrian refugee is the stigma around mental health, and especially around men and single men, because mental health does not discriminate gender, and it does not discriminate your background or your nationality. Every one of us could suffer and experience mental health problems. So there is a huge need for support and provide access and facilities for people in the hotels at the moment, and also in general for asylum seekers, so that they have that possibility and opportunity to speak with others and not feel isolated in their houses. And finally, I think the other huge barrier is the asylum support. Like we said, most of us and all of us are stuck home. Our spending is increasing. What we eat, what we spend is obviously so much more than usual. And imagine being £37 a week. It's like, what do you even buy with that? Do you buy your top up, which finishes in an hour or so? Do you buy food for your kids? And how do you continue buying and continue providing support for yourself? And this just showed, once again, the inequality and the discrimination that asylum seekers and refugees are facing as a result of the ongoing hostile environment, and a clear need to the policies in this country so that people are actually treated like human beings rather than numbers and figures.
Mm-hmm. And Hyab, do you have any insight at all into what's happening to refugees outside the UK just now? I mean, clearly, in some of the large refugee camps, it's very difficult to maintain good hygiene. It's very difficult to maintain good physical distancing. All of these things that are likely to cause outbreaks of COVID-19. Do you have any insight into what's happening elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, a lot of things. I just came back in February from Egypt, and I've seen a lot of challenges that refugees are facing, particularly after the lockdowns because of the pandemic. And lack of resources is one of the main issues in those places. For some refugees who are living in refugee camps, for instance, in Sudan, places that I know very well, the refugees do not even have adequate water, enough water, not let alone sanitary equipment, and they don't even get access to any medicines or any health services. It is so difficult in those places where refugees have nothing. But they do also have like some protective factors, particularly that comes from refugee-led initiatives. There are some refugee-led organizations, small organizations within the campus, within the towns or cities in those places where they provide information, they share information or guidances about the pandemic, and they also provide some basic resources. They also have a network with diaspora refugees who live here, and they support their refugees, other refugees in those places as well. There is a lot of things going on between refugees and among themselves as well. There are a lot of refugee-led initiatives taking place in those places when they have no support from the government.
Mm-hmm. And are you seeing any the likes of the British government taking any interest in helping with those efforts?
It's difficult. I haven't seen anything particularly during this time when after the COVID started. There are still refugees, thousands of refugees in detention centers in Libya. There are thousands of refugee camps with no adequate resources, as I just said. And I haven't seen the big countries and rich countries taking some initiatives to support those communities.
Mm. Now, finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about wider issues of racism, particularly in light of what we've seen in the last few weeks. First of all, in the US, then spreading here, and then this week we saw an asylum seekers protest in George Square attacked by right-wing thugs. Alison, I'll maybe come to you first as the one with the most experience of Scotland. What's been your feeling about the way Scotland has responded to this sudden kind of upsurge in interest in addressing the legacy of racism in Scotland?
Yep, we're all really busy again at the moment. So I think there's a couple of things to say, and they may sound a little harsh. I think a lot of people have suddenly woken up to what's around them and feel really passionate about it. And that's fantastic. It's wonderful to have lots more people suddenly wanting to work on these issues and wanting to take them seriously. And I think one of the things that happens when that occurs, and we saw this in 2015, where with the so-called refugee crisis, that suddenly lots of people were there and wanting to be involved. And those few people, I mean, I'm thinking a lot of, people like Graham Campbell at the moment, people who have been leading figures within BMIS and CREA in particular, and race relations organisations in Scotland, who've worked away at this for years. I'm thinking of my colleagues at the University of Glasgow who've done deep, detailed, difficult work in archives, tracing back the legacies of slavery, actually looking at racism today, not just in the history, and then seeing what's happening. And we appear to have decided that this issue is about knocking white men off plinths. And not actually tackling systemic issues. And I would really say, if we are taking Black Lives Matter really seriously, then it is about police brutality, and we have to get our own house in order. And that is very clear that there will be a public inquiry into the cases of police brutality that we have seen within Scotland that were called by Humza Yousaf as when he became Cabinet Secretary for Justice, and that's a step in the right direction. But it should not have taken the campaigns that it's taken to get to that point. And I think there's a real need for people to take the time and to actually listen to what the people who've been doing this work are saying and doing and get alongside with that. So there's an awful lot of knee-jerk reactions going on. Suddenly every institution has to produce its statement, as we had to under Me Too, as we had to around refugees, without people going, wait a minute, maybe people have been doing something. So rather than assuming that because I've just had a good set of feelings, everyone else must have been getting it wrong. Actually, this is more nuanced and more complicated, and an awful lot of work has been going on. Glasgow City Council has been doing some work. A lot of councillors have been doing work. A lot of politicians have been doing work. Activist groups have been campaigning and campaigning and campaigning. There have been protest after protest after protest. For as long as I've been standing in George Square, there have been banners on these issues. This is not new, it's just bigger. And it's got a lot of heat and energy around it. And my worry and my metaphor that has come to me about it at the moment is that we are in danger of trying to pull up a tree by the branches, and we're not digging at the roots. And the roots of racism are in the way in which our laws are discriminatory. The roots of racism are in the Windrush scandal, in what happened at Grenfell. The roots of racism are daily in the asylum decision-making and its shoddy quality. The roots of racism are in the fact that it is one of the most vulnerable, precarious populations in our country who were put into vans and taken to hotels. That is where the issues lie. And yeah, public symbols really matter. And the work that people like Jeff Palmer and Graham Campbell have done around this really matters. So we need to have a degree of humility and take a beat and think about it and listen to people who have and continue to experience racism day in, day out. As mother of a black daughter, it's real. This happens. It's absolutely true. And I see it equally as the leader of a team at the University of Glasgow where 50% of our staff are black and ethnic minority. I see it every time I cross an international border. They are pulled up. I am not. I have to stand with them. This is work that needs a lot of thought, a lot of care, and we're not going to get there overnight. It's not going to be one statement of, hey, you know, I'm a recovering racist, that'll get us there. This is work for the long term. Yeah. This is work for a lifetime, and we won't accomplish it any more than the abolition of slavery was not accomplished and still has not been accomplished. We won't accomplish it with a few demonstrations.
Yeah. Hyab, if I could come to you now. What's been your experience of watching this this explosion of interest and concern about systemic racism? Presumably somebody who I don't think it's too much of a stretch to assume that you've experienced quite a bit of racism in Scotland. What's been your response to seeing this sudden kind of interest in the subject?
Yeah, I think for me, I personally have been dealing with these issues for ages now, since I left my own country 10 years ago. And I think people are marching now, asking questions, asking difficult questions, saying that we have been treated badly, we have been treated unfairly and differently, and we need to be listened now. And people wanted to be listened now this time. And this has been the case for a generation, as Alison just mentioned it. Then people are tired of this. Many people are devastated by what's happening around them, what's happening to their family members, what's happening to them personally as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Pinar, we've only got a few minutes left, so just solve racism for us in the last couple of minutes here. There's a history in Scotland, of course, of sectarianism, which largely was a response to Irish Catholics fleeing a famine and ending up in Scotland. They were, in many ways, refugees themselves. And now we see similar groups of people victimizing asylum seekers and other people from black and ethnic minorities. Is there something about Scotland you think that is special in this way, that's something that's unique about Scotland, or is Scottish racism just exactly the same as racism everywhere else?
I think, first of all, we need to acknowledge that racism does happen in our communities, whether if it's in Scotland or across the world. And it does impact on an individual and community and a national level. In my previous job, I used to work on a project looking at sectarianism in Scotland. And as you've mentioned, there's at the moment especially, it's bringing up people's angers, and it seems that we have a long way to go to tackle sectarianism, to tackle racism at a national, community and at a political level. And this reflects on all of us taking part in it. And I think that initially, like what Alison had mentioned, is for us to take actually step back and critically think about the role that UK played in throughout the history, looking at the British Empire and actually informing the general public and having this in our education system. I think one of the key aspects is for people to have the knowledge, and for the future generations and even for now, people to be educated, for that exchange of dialogue to happen, and to have a space where we actually try to understand each other, and to say that there is no place for racists in George Square or in our communities and in our cities. And like you said, historically, when you look at the history of this country, it is, and we are all refugees. We could all be refugees. We could all be asylum seekers. We could all be migrants or expats or whatever you call it. And it's these labels that are given to people and individuals that is the problem. And just to finally say that, I think as communities, as individuals, we all have a role to play in this. And we must all say that there is no place for racists and fascists in our communities and in our streets. Because if we don't challenge, if none of us challenges, if we all stay silent, then it's going to be the racist having the platform to talk, and not the communities and the individuals. So we must all say that this is our streets, this is our world, and this is our country. And we do not welcome any sort of racism. whether this is in our institutions, whether this is in your workplace, in the place that where you send your kids, or if in the places in your community, or it could be a family member making a joke or a remark about a member of the community. So I think we all have a role to play in this to challenge any sort of discrimination and racism. And I just like to mention that tomorrow is World Refugee Day, and I see that Refugee Day as every day. It shouldn't have one day, but we should all acknowledge the pains, the journeys, the sorrows that every individual makes as a result of war or discrimination or political reasons, and that we all must understand that we all could be refugees and we all could migrate at one point in our lifetime, and to say that this world belongs to all of us, not to the political parties or the nations, and that we should not have actually borders in the first place.
Well, that is quite a note to end on. Sorry? Yeah, very quickly, I want to just run down that poll before we go. We didn't have time to add it to the news script at the top of the show, but that was a poll of people in Scotland. 73% of Scots think people seeking asylum should be allowed to work to support themselves and their families. 52% think people seeking asylum should receive financial support in line with current rates of universal credit. 59% believe it would be better for Scotland to run its own asylum and immigration system, and 74% believe it's important to make refugees feel welcome in Scotland. So a quarter of people don't. I will note that a quarter of people in Scotland also vote Tory. But I'm sure that's entirely coincidence. That is, we are just out of time now. So I would like to thank Alison, Pinar and Hyab for joining us. It's been a pleasure to talk to all three of you. I'm sure we could have talked for a lot longer. I think we've probably raised more questions than found answers, but maybe that's part of the point of this, is to give us all something more to think about. Before we go, Pinar, I would just like to ask, you mentioned that Lift the Ban campaign. Where can people find that online if they want to sign that petition?
Yeah, if they just search Lift the Ban and look into Refugee Action's website, then they can find the petition there and share it around. Okay,
brilliant. Well, as I say, that is all we've got time for. So thank you very much at home for joining us. It's always worth making these shows, knowing that we get an audience for them. So if you're able to support Broadcasting Scotland, we would please encourage you to do so. It's the only thing that makes it possible for us to make these shows is your donations. So if you can, please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up as a supporter. Your £5 a month will make a huge difference to what we're able to do here. If you're not able to support us financially, you can still help us by spreading the word about what Broadcasting Scotland is and what we do here. Follow us on Twitter @BroadcastScot, search Broadcasting Scotland on Facebook. Share the shows around, let people know what we've been talking about and why you think it's worth watching. If you can encourage someone else to watch who then donates, then you've saved yourself the £5 and still got the same amount of money coming into us. And if you want to get involved here as well, there's also plenty of opportunities to do so, whether it's being in front of the camera like me, or being behind the camera on the technical side, or working as a journalist to help us prepare these stories, prepare the shows for us. Then there's lots of opportunities here. If anybody would like to get involved, anyone you know wants to get involved in TV production, however that might be, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. But that is absolutely all we've got time for tonight. So again, thank you to Alison, Pinar and Hyab, and I'll be back again on Sunday with the full Scottish. But until then, have a brilliant weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you.